Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today, it might seem like my topic is fairly all over the place and that it doesn't have much connection to the entertainment industry, which is what I usually cover. Today, I'm going to talk about a lot of ideas and the interconnectedness of a lot of ideas that I talked about in the past. But the basic gist of it is how your quote unquote progressive people and their movement have used the high trust in our society to destroy that high trust in our society in an attempt to destroy the society itself. And yes, it does have a slight connection to entertainment because it's A, where I begin, and B is significant because entertainment is used to erode that high trust in the society through these quote unquote progressive methods. Plus, I most of the time like to use comics as my background for what I'm talking about. So I'm going to use Reed Richards as a portrayal of the objective and Victor Van Doom as the portrayal of the subjective here. And also, just to let everybody know before I start, there are two links in the description and in the pinned comment for my 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, and 1 return to form for low fantasy sword and sorcery. This is entertainment based upon the heroic ideal and the tried and tested merit-based methods of telling a story, both visually and through the writing, which is my part. You're looking at some of the beautiful art for those graphic novels in the background. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. And I'm going to start, I think, a new thing here where I will take one of the trailers for one of my books and put it at the very end of the video. That way it doesn't interrupt your video in any way. But if you want to see more about my books and get to the end of the video, it will be there. Or you can just fast forward to the last minute and a half, minute and 45 seconds, so you can see something more about what my books are about. But back to my topic, and as I warned, the topic does begin with entertainment. It begins with comics. Simply for me, anyways, because I was listening to another video from Richard Meyer, and he was talking once more about the situation with Ed Piscor's death. And I don't wish to speak ill of the dead, nor do I wish to make light of any of the situation, but I'm also not going to allow the emotions running high with this entire thing to cloud the fact that we should look at this analytically and use it sort of as a case study to understand the very heart and origin of how these quote unquote progressive people manipulate things in order to control society through what is essentially shame. Now, very briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, very, very briefly, what is the Ed Piskor situation? Well, Ed Piskor was an independent comic creator, but he came to independence more under the old system, and therefore he certainly had connections to the mainstream comic industry and its quote unquote progressive movement. I would say he probably leaned more towards the progressive side than towards anything like Comicsgate. However, he wanted to be left out of the entire thing. He was trying his best to be non political, while at the same time talk about how the old methods of creating comics worked. And the mainstream comic industry, or at the very least, some parts of the mainstream comic industry, found that to be objectionable and so subjected him to a flurry of accusations, which seemed to be baseless, in order to shame him and destroy his life, or at the very least to get him to bend the knee so that he would never do anything against your quote unquote progressive mainstream comic industry, which eventually led him to voluntarily shuffle off this mortal coil. And the thing being, when I was listening to Richard just reference it one more time, and I don't think he's ever going to stop referencing it, and quite honestly, I think that's quite appropriate. But the thing is that, again, when listening to Richard talk about this situation, I thought to myself, okay, this is a pure example of shame culture that I've been talking about for years. And at the same time, Richard also talked about how what happened to Ed Piskor, he thinks in the future, will be classified as a crime, a serious crime, that it will be thought about as murder, which Ed Piskor did himself leave a note saying, "These people are my murderers." And he named the people in the comic industry that had been piling on him with these untrue accusations. But the more I thought about those interconnected ideas, the more I saw the truth of the matter. And yes, there will come a time where we're all going to look back at this quote unquote progressive stuff and we're going to say, how in the world did anybody ever believe any of that? Well, the point is that, again, we live in a high trust society. We trust the people around us to actually live according to the rules of that society, which are based upon the truth. And these people are subverting our expectations of trust in order to destroy any trust within our society. That's why, again, we'll look back at this and say, why were we ever that naive to believe any of this stuff to begin with? It wasn't that we were naive, it's that we were a high trust society based upon objective rules. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go way back to the origin of many of these ideas and see how they're all interconnected together. Now, as I have referenced several times in the past, what these quote unquote progressive people as a movement are trying to do is to regress our civilization back to a ancient and pagan way of thinking. They are essentially creating an ancient state through neo-paganism. So let's go back to the ancient world and look at this from that perspective from a moment. And I'm talking even pre-Romans and Greeks. Now, there is scholarship to heavily suggest the idea that the ancient civilizations before the Greeks and the Romans were indeed matriarchal in nature, whereas the Greeks and the Romans were more patriarchal in nature, or at the very least were trying to extract themselves from that matriarchal and to move more and more into the patriarchal. Now, when I say that, and when this body of study says that, does it mean that women were in control? No. Does it mean that women were given choice positions within these societies? No. What does it mean? It means that the people and the institutions that ran these ancient civilizations thought in a more feminine way than masculine way. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to the science I always talk about over and over again. Go back to those studies that we know about how little babies, male and female, think differently and are attracted to different things. Male children, from the very time that they can see, are attracted to mechanical things, whereas female children are more attracted to human faces. This leads to a development of thought which diverges from each other, wherein men are typically going to be fascinated by and pursue things that are much more mechanical, and women are going to pursue things that are much more based upon human interaction and essentially things that are much more emotional. Or to break it down into more simplistic but logical terms, males think in a more objective way about objective things, and females think in a more subjective way about subjective things. Objectivity being a thing is what it is because that's reality, in essence, and subjective being it is because I know it, or I like it, or I believe it, not because it's based upon reality. It might be, but that's not the core of it. Now, how does this all tie into what I'm talking about with paganism and neo-paganism? Well, just for a second, look at practically any polytheistic religion. And I don't care if you're going back to ancient Sumerians or you're looking at modern Hinduism and Shintoism. Doesn't matter. Any polytheistic religion basically has the mindset that there's a god in pretty much everything. This stand of trees has a god. That river has a god. The moon is a god. The sky is a god. Everything is a god, a separate god, and they all do their own thing. This leads to a very subjective mindset. Why? Because if every god has the power in their own realm to make their own rules, then you can't look at any overarching rules that are going to control everything. No, it's going to be changes wherever you go. You can't evaluate according to one standard. And therefore, it's just the subjective whim of those gods in those things that change the rules here and there, and therefore, as a human being, just live in that same subjective way. That's what ancient paganism was, and that's what, again, some of these academic authors would reference as the subjective point that is a connection to the matriarchal way of thinking within these societies and how they were run. And before moving on, I should also add at this point that if you look at any of these spheres of influence that these gods would have power over, that's exactly the thing. They have power there, and therefore it is power that controls. And so you see it that way in these ancient societies that might makes right. There doesn't need to be any objective, rational way of thinking, even from the rulers themselves. It was just, I have the power, I'm doing this. And what do we have within modern quote unquote progressive ideology? It all comes down, as I always say, to power. It's nothing more than power dynamics. That's it. But let's for a second contrast that with what you start to see within the Greeks and a little more within the Romans and then full bore with Christianity. It's the idea, the monotheistic idea that there is one God, that God sets the rules. There are very, very few exceptions to any of those rules that control all of reality. Therefore, you can have one overarching set of rules for all of reality, for everyone, everywhere, to reference in order to understand things. This is why such ideas lead to the development of science. Why? Because in a polytheistic way of looking at it, if any god can change the rules in their sphere whenever they want, what's the point of looking for any overarching rules? Because there simply aren't any. But within a monotheistic way of thinking, where there is one god who sets one set of rules, you'll say, okay, what are those set of rules? Let's explore those and find out how nature, reality, everything works. And we can do that. We can do that in a logical and rational way. And quite honestly, logic and reason, in their implementation at the very least, are a subset of this kind of thinking, because it is the assumption at the core that a thing is what it is and it's not going to arbitrarily just change. That's one of the key elements, the very first rule of logic. A thing is what it is. Now, this entire thing leads to what I was talking about, the difference between shame culture and guilt culture, and I've referenced this a number of times in the past. It follows along these same lines. These ancient civilizations were, in essence, shame cultures, whereas your Greeks and your Romans had a bit of a mixed bag of the two. And if you go into Christianity and what has been our way of thinking for the last 2,000 years, it is a guilt culture, not a shame culture. Now, very briefly, again, what is the difference? Well, the difference is in a guilt culture, people internalize the rules so that when they do something wrong, their conscience points the finger at themselves and says, you've done something wrong, rectify the situation. But within a shame culture, they don't believe any of that can exist. Therefore, in order to enforce the rules of society and the community, people must point the fingers at each other and say, you do wrong, you must change. And it's funny because in order for them to actually do that, first of all, they need to be caught. And one of the things I haven't discussed before is the fact that in a shame culture, how are you going to be caught? Well, you're going to be caught because everyone's always poking their nose into your business, which, by the way, let's look at modern progressivism and see where that applies. And this has a connection to my major theme of this entire video, is the fact that in a guilt culture where everybody assumes that you're operating according to these rules, you have very private societies. Why? Because you can be assumed in a high trust society, people trust you to do what is right because your conscience will be your guide. But within a shame culture, no. Everyone must poke their nose into your problems, into your life. Why? Because they got to make sure that things run smoothly. And if there's something you need to be ashamed of, they need to shame you for it, so you will be ashamed of it. Or in essence, this is a very low trust kind of society, to say the least. And oh, by the way, this is also connected to the reason why your low trust societies need to have draconian rules, because it can't trust any of its citizens to do the right thing. And again, think about your modern progressivism and how it's leaning more and more towards totalitarianism. And I suppose here would be a good point to point out the fact that, yes, there is a connection between objectivity and a guilt culture. Why? Because you might be asking yourself, these rules that people internalize could all just be made up. Well, they could be, but just like game theory, which is a basically made up set of rules, and then you apply logical analysis to those made up set of rules, works, but doesn't work in reality itself. So the same happens when you try to base a society upon made up kinds of rules rather than the rules of reality. It doesn't exactly fit. It doesn't exactly work. Why? Because the whole process of a guilt culture is based upon, as I've been talking about, conscience. And conscience is an idea that is not only connected to logic and reason, because it's literally a re-understanding, that's the etymology of the word, a re-understanding of how things work, and that's what logic and reason do, by taking a whole bunch of particular situations, extracting one rule from all of them, following that rule upwards to a universal, and then, after understanding that universal in a better way, reinterpreting how those particular events actually played out under the auspice of this larger rule. That's exactly what your conscience does, but for your understanding how all of these rules play out in your life. And again, logic and reason itself, and conscience in this instance, is tied essentially to reality, objective reality. So it's not, I re-understand the rules of the game better. It's, I re-understand how human beings and human interactions actually work according to reality. That's a fine line within conscience that a lot of people don't really look at, but it indeed is there. And I would like to indeed at this point describe more and more of this interconnectedness, but the video is going to be long enough as it is. Okay, so let's take stock of all these things I've been talking about for just a minute. These ancient cultures were, in essence, matriarchal in nature. They were based upon subjective ideas with subjective norms. Their institutions were based upon might makes right, and they were shame cultures, not guilt cultures. Now let's look at modern progressivism just for 1 second and see how all of that applies. First off, matriarchal in nature. What are they constantly trying to push? Where does this progressive push to a large extent come from? Well, it comes from feminism. Let's look at the subjectivity. Again, this progressive ideology is one where they say there is no truth. There's just a whole bunch of your little truths. That's pure subjectivity. And I should throw in here the point about ancient paganism. Again, all of those apply to the neo-paganism that they're trying to institute right now. First of all, they hate Christianity. They want to get rid of it. And they want to institute, in essence, their own kind of religion. And if you look at something like the strain of environmentalism that goes through progressivism, what is that? Well, that's just Gaia worship. That's just ancient paganism. Thirdly, within these draconian rules of these ancient civilizations where might makes right, and what do you have within progressivism? You have, since there is no truth, those with the most power are the ones that get to set the subjective rules. And as for shame culture, all you got to do is look at cancel culture, which is a part of shame culture. That's all cancel culture is. It's not based upon our rules as a society today of law. Why? Because that law, in essence, goes back to objective norms of natural law. No, it's based upon we subjectively think that you should no longer be able to live in this society, and therefore we will shame you until you are either ejected from this society or you're cut off so much so that you might as well be ejected from this society, or you eject yourself from this society, which the most harsh implementation of that would be the Ed Piskor route, where you, again, end your existence on this mortal coil. Which, by the way, go back to those ancient civilizations, even the Greeks and Romans, which were half and half, and look at their way of viewing self-ending. Again, it was part and parcel of, I can't live under this shame, which, by the way, is directly connected to why we've seen an acceptance of that kind of thing from government bodies over the last 50 years. When I was a kid, such a thing was considered illegal and you would go to prison if you tried it. When I was in high school and we were studying law, it had changed to, well, they shouldn't be sent to prison. They have mental problems. They should be sent to a mental institution. Now it's, if you want to end yourself, well, let's help you with that. Come to the government. We'll help you. Why? This is all part and parcel of shame culture. And it's tied in with some of the other things that I've been talking about, like the fact that within this shame culture, it's based upon a non-rational, non-logical, non-reality-based set of ideas and institutions. And oh, by the way, where do a lot of these people come from? Why do they have such horrible ideas that they want to end their existence? Well, it might just be by the fact that over the last 50 years, this shame culture has been implemented on top of things like science. And a lot of these quote-unquote lifestyles that we see promoted today, which used to be, more than 50 years ago, considered a mental illness because of scientific medical study, are no longer considered that. Why are they no longer considered that? Was there any scientific evidence to make that change? No, it was political pressure implemented upon science in order to force them to make said changes. And even today, you can't ask certain questions within the medical scientific community. You can't do certain kinds of research, even if it's based upon the truth, because your funding will be taken away and you will be shamed into oblivion. So you can see how this shame culture pervades everything, how it is affecting more and more of our society, and how it is interconnected with all of these, what seem to be, for a lot of people, interconnected problems within our society, within our civilization. So I want to give an example of this and talk about that for a moment or two before segueing back into how this shame culture affects the question at the beginning of this video, which is how they're using high trust society to destroy high trust society. Now, for a second, let's look at the opposite of this shame culture. And it's very funny because your quote unquote progressive people with their shame culture keep on calling everybody militaristic 1930s Germans. But for a second, let's go back to the Nuremberg trials when we had these 1930s militaristic Germans defeated in war, and we were then applying standards not of war, but of civilization, of law, to these people and their actions. If you look at those trials and apply a modern progressive standard to them, these 1930s militaristic Germans would have gotten off scot-free. Why? Because their basic defense was, well, we didn't do anything wrong. We were just following orders. The government, the military, they told us to do these things, and so we did them. We didn't have any other choice but to do them as subjects of the rulers of our country and the military within which we served. And the reason why that didn't cut any ice at the Nuremberg trials was because they said, no, you have a conscience. Each one of you has a conscience. Your conscience would have informed you at some point that what you were doing was wrong. And so you were warned by your conscience that this was wrong. You did know that what you were doing was wrong, and you did it anyways. Therefore, you are responsible for these actions. You see how that is a guilt-based society way of thinking of the rules and how their connection to the objective reality of truth actually plays out. Through what? Again, through the conscience. Or to put it another way, you will see that that judgment itself and the system wherein the judgment was made was based upon following a system that assumed an objective reality to be true. But if you look at the modern way which these quote-unquote progressives want to implement law, it's all based upon this subjective shame culture. If you look at how and why not only judges are appointed and have been for the last, 15 to 20 years at the very least. And again, I talked about this before. If you look at the appointment of judges under the Obama administration and the Clinton administration, you will see them appointing more and more judges who don't believe in unalienable rights, who don't believe in the connection of law to natural law, who believe that it simply comes from the power of the state, which, by the way, is completely contrary to the idea, the founding principle of America itself. But what in essence they were trying to do, and you do see this in other institutions as well, unfortunately, is the democratization of law. And again, must point out here that America is not a democracy. It is a constitutional republic that uses democratic methods within some of its systems. The Founding Fathers would be horrified with these people today saying, we must defend our democracy. It's not a democracy. The Founding Fathers hated democracy. And so did many, many thinkers all the way throughout history. Yes, even going back to the ancient Greeks. Why? Because as the old saying goes, democracy is simply two wolves and a sheep deciding what they want to have for dinner. Democracy is rule of the mob. Therefore, you can use some democratic methods, but democracy is not a system of government that you want to live under. But again, what they're trying to do is democratize law itself and to say, well, we're implementing this law subjectively here because society pressures us to do so, just like happened within science. And the reversal of these lifestyles as healthy, quote unquote, healthy lifestyles. And again, where does it all come from? Well, it all starts with the microcosm of the individuals and how they live according to shame culture. The system of judgment begins with the people shaming the person to begin with, saying, no, you did something wrong according to our rules of our society. And again, we're going to shame you more and more. And if that doesn't work, we'll employ these larger shame method systems, which should be, in their minds, law itself. And again, as I have been talking about before, not only in a high-trust society do you get people leaving each other alone, but in a low-trust society, you get people poking their nose into everybody's business. Why? Because, of course, and this answers the question why most people would say, why do these people want to poke their nose into everything? Why? Because the method of having democratized law, where the mob controls what actually is quote-unquote legal, is a process wherein law is simply the end of your condemnation, the end of your implementation of the rules. The beginning of the implementation doesn't start with the legal courts, doesn't start with the police. It starts with individuals policing each other, with individuals saying, is there something in your life that I need to shame you about? Maybe I should look into it a little more. You don't seem to be following the rules that I'm familiar with, subjectively. And very briefly, the connective tissue with entertainment and this entire thing is the fact that, again, it's an intermediary step. Before they can get to that pure democratization of your progressive so-called legal system, they need to move step by step into societal acceptance of it, which is the exact same thing which we see within modern thought with the implementation of game theory on logic. To say, no, we'll apply logic, but only within this certain set of rules. We're not going to bring reality into it. We're going to say, if X were true, then Y would follow. But if someone points out, but hey, X isn't true, not according to reality, they'll be excluded from the conversation. And this is the exact same thing you see within entertainment right now. Entertainment is based upon a story. A story should be, in its ancient way of construction, throughout thousands of years in Western civilization, a representation of reality. But they have cut out that representation of reality and said, within the recent memory, let's just take this story and say, if X were to happen, Y would then follow. And let's tell that lie so many times that people think that X is a given within reality itself, when it isn't. And the moment someone says, oh, let's say, us people within Comicsgate, we say, hey, wait a second, X is not real. X is a bad way to tell a story. X is not according to a standard of merit, which is good storytelling. They shun you. They cut you out. They say, these kinds of entertainment are not for you. Go away. Again, shame culture. And that's why they must implement only their kind of storytelling. Only progressives can actually tell a story. Why? Because they need to implement more and more the lie that X is true, and not allow anyone to actually think that, maybe X isn't true. Maybe according to reality, Y is not going to follow because X is not true. This is why entertainment is so instrumental in this kind of shame culture. This is why entertainment must become propaganda instead of being proper storytelling. And not only that, but this is why the precepts of shame culture must be applied to every last person who creates any kind of entertainment. And this is why poor Ed Piskor is no longer in this world. Why? Because he leaned more towards that quote-unquote progressive way of thinking. He was part and parcel of this shame culture. He was indeed shamed by these people because he didn't follow exactly the rules that they wanted him to follow. Therefore, they subjected him to so much shame that the world that he knew was completely taken away from him. And the only thing left for him to do, in his mind anyways, was to end his existence. Because that's the point of shame culture. They control your destiny. They control whether or not you can interact with anyone else in this world. They control whether or not you're going to be happy. They control whether or not you live. And this is also why, if you have a guilt culture mindset still, you have a blanket immunity to this shame culture nonsense. I just explained last week about how when these shame culture kind of people in a workplace that I was employed in tried to shame me into not being competitive, it didn't make any impact on me at all because I don't care. I had absolutely nothing to do with their societal way of running their businesses. And really, since I'm based upon traditions of pure guilt culture, the only time someone's going to tell me or convince me that something I did was wrong is if my conscience also agrees with that. Then none of that had any impact on me, and none of that will have any impact on you. And I'm sure most of you listening to my voice are here, certainly at the end of this long video, because you have that strain within you as well. But to get back to that statement I made at the first of this video, how do these quote-unquote progressive people use our high-trust society in order to destroy our high-trust society? And why are we allowing this to happen? Why? Because we have not lived in a shame culture within Western civilization for more than 2,000 years. Therefore, we trust other people within our society implicitly without even thinking that, yes, their conscience is going to be their guide. And so when we run up against these people who have no conscience, or everybody has a conscience, so who work actively at every turn to disregard their conscience, their actions to us, first of all, are bizarre and we don't understand them. But secondly, the people on the quote unquote progressive side understand completely how to use guilt culture to their advantage in order to, oddly enough, promote shame culture. This is part of the whole cancel culture movement. These people, according to shame culture, will accuse you of something and try to shame you. If you're a part of guilt culture, and most of us still are, what people almost second nature tend to do, and most people are understanding more and more now that you don't do, is that they apologize. And or they make some statement of, I'm going to look into this to try to rectify some of my actions, because we understand that conscience is not a foolproof mechanism. Therefore, something may have escaped my conscience. I trust that you, as part of the high trust society, are acting according to your conscience, and your conscience is telling you as an individual person, or most notably, they come together as a collection of individuals to make it look like they're a larger part of society. They're saying that no, what you've done is wrong. So a normal person would say, my conscience didn't pick up on that. I'm sorry, perhaps I should look into this, perhaps I should rectify my actions according to this. And when that happens, blood is in the water. Not only will they see that as weakness, but they will use that as a mechanism, part of their shaming mechanism, in order to destroy you. Why? Because they will say, well, why are you apologizing? Why are you apologizing unless you're guilty? Why are you trying to rectify your life unless you're guilty? Again, guilt doesn't have any part of what they actually believe. They're simply using guilt. They will use your apology. They will use your understanding, your attempted understanding of the situation to say, well, obviously, if you're apologizing or trying to rectify your life, you must be guilty of something. Obviously, your conscience is telling you you are guilty of something, and they're going to use that more and more to shame you. They don't believe in this guilt. They don't believe in conscience. They don't believe in any of these things, but they will use it to shame you even more, to bring you more and more into the shame culture so that you can be controlled. This is the insidious way that cancel culture actually works. This is the insidious way that shame culture uses guilt culture to try to implement shame culture. And this is why people in the future, hopefully 10 years from now, but at the very least 20 or 30 years from now, are going to look back and say, why in the world did anybody actually believe any of this stuff? Why were they so naive in order to believe any of that stuff? It's not that we're naive right now. It's the fact that we've lived under a guilt culture for so long, where the standard was reality that we referenced, that we had a high trust society where we trusted these people actually had some kind of point based upon reality when they brought up one of these objections. But more and more, we're going to have to learn that no, these people are not trustworthy. And funny enough, that these people who are not trustworthy must be cut out from our high trust society. And it's really not surprising when you think about it for 2 seconds. If these people don't believe in truth, if their postmodern, quote-unquote, progressive way of thinking is there is no truth, there's only, at best, my truth or your truth. If these people have no standard of truth whereby to act with not just themselves, but with society and the other people around them, if they do not set the bedrock as truth as it exists within reality, obviously they're not trustworthy. Why? Because trust is based upon the truth. Sure, you can have your own subjective truth within yourself. You go ahead and have that. But if you're interacting with me, we need to interact with something larger than your subjective truth. We need to interact under a larger, overarching statement of truth. And if you don't admit to any truth at all outside of yourself, then no, you can't be trusted. And again, we must excise these people from high trust society. Why? Because they will use the exact methods of a high trust society, as I have just said, to destroy high trust society. And what more, since they're based upon shame culture to begin with, if you excise them from the society, they're going to be shamed. And they just might turn around, or at the very least, make a good show of turning around to actually follow the rules of reality. And this goes for large and small interactions alike. I always love that line from Augustine of Hippo. He's talking about his detractors, and he says, I'm not going to answer those detractors, at the very least not right now. Why? Because they seek contention rather than truth, which is exactly what these quote-unquote progressive people do. If they want to so-called discuss something with you or argue something with you, they're not actually seeking any kind of truth. They're simply asking to do that because they want contention. Why do they want contention? They want contention with you, with an audience, so that you look contentious, so that they can then shame you and excise you from their society, or what they wish to implement as society. And again, it all goes back to that ancient idea I started with the difference between a matriarchal and a patriarchal way of thinking about things within society. They want everything to be communal. They want everything to be democratized. They want everything to be based upon the idea, the subjective. Even society itself saying, well, since society is based upon the communal and you're being objectionable because you're being contentious, you're ruffling up feathers, well then obviously you have to be excised from our society. And you take that and you match it with the way that our society has worked for thousands of years, saying, no, you see, society is based upon a set of rules. Those rules are connected with reality, and it doesn't matter who you are or what you actually say, as long as you acknowledge that the truth exists and you're going to follow the rules of the truth, the overarching rules, which are implemented there in our society to ensure that we live out our societal norms in a way that connects and affects everyone in an equal manner. And to try to bring this all back down to the street level once more, this is why within entertainment today, within the systems of entertainment that we see, these industries, first of all, want to make themselves into a community, always talking about this community of creative people. Why? Because it's all based upon shame culture. But this is also why these industries, I don't think, are in any way, shape, or form redeemable. Why? Because they have instituted in their own little sphere what they see as the more perfect society, which is something so contrary to Western civilization in the way that it actually works, that we haven't seen it in thousands and thousands of years. They are, in essence, micro-shame culture societies that they have set up. And there's no way to fix that unless you completely destroy the basis of their understanding of how things work. And oh, by the way, you'll completely destroy it by entering ideas into the situation like merit. But this is also why they're headed on a self-destructive path. Their communities are not based upon anything real. Their communities are based upon totalitarian rules of shaming and destruction that does not interact with the rules of reality, and therefore they're building a house of cards that will eventually fall. And that's why I keep on saying, if you can create something, become part of what is essentially, as we now call, the parallel culture, because we can look once again back at history and see when this method was tried before, when they tried to take society and revert it back to an ancient form after all that we have gone through as a civilization to become more and more civilized, it will eventually fall apart. Whether or not they destroy a whole lot of the society with it, that's another question, but it will eventually fall apart. And the only things left at the end of the day are those small little systems still based upon the truth, still based upon the rules of reality. And that works for culture as well. So don't be shamed into thinking that you can't create anything of value. Set your eyes on the standard of merit, because since merit is based upon the bedrock of reality, that is the only standard that is going to survive into the future. So, I know this was a rambling video and probably much too long, but if I gave you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe if you're not subscribed, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels, stories based upon the heroic ideal and merit-based systems of storytelling. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. And as I said, I'm going to play one of the trailers for one of those books in a moment. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.
An age ago, the beating heart of our people was a king who knew only victory. He wanted nothing more than an honorable death on the battlefield. Yet, none could match him, and so he wandered the earth, becoming lost in time and tide. Then we too lost our honest purpose, while silk-clad men sat upon the throne. But tremble now, all cities that lay under the stars, for out of the shadows and mists of the land of promise, our courage has been rekindled, our heart has returned, and the world will